Pam, I'll tell you when everybody is back. Just waiting for a few more people.
Sounds good.
Okay, Pam, I think we can start.
Okay. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I really wish I could be in the room where it happens, but maybe that'll happen in the next couple of days. But meanwhile, welcome to Gender, Justice, and Generative AI. So what I think I'll do is just introduce each of our speakers in order, and then after they finish, I'll respond. And then we'll open it for discussion. All right, so I would like to begin by introducing Filipa Calado, who uses digital tools to study language related to sex, gender, and sexuality. She experiments with methods like text analysis and machine learning to think critically about the way technology transforms language data. Most recently, she's using AI tools to study discourses of transphobia in the United States. Until June of this year, she was the Digital Scholarship Specialist at Princeton University Library. And starting in the fall, and congratulations on this, she will be the Assistant Professor at Pratt's Institute School of Information. She received her PhD in English from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Welcome, Filipa.
Thank you. It's great to see you all digitally. I'm going to share my screen now, and let me see if I can do that. Okay. Oh, it seems that, I'm sorry, I got a new computer for a new job. It seems that I have to reopen Zoom in order to share my screen. I'll have to jump off and jump back on. Or I could send you all a link for the slideshow, but I think it'll be easier if I just jump off and jump back on. So I'll do that very quickly. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay, let's try. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. And here, my slideshow. Let me just organize my windows here. Okay, great. So thank you everyone for having me here today. The title of my talk is a little different from what's on the program because my project has progressed a little bit. The new title is Plausibility in Passing, Using LLMs to Study Anti-Trans Discourse. So in this talk, I'm going to share some of my work customizing large language models to study bias and discrimination in language. Specifically, I'm interested in how language can encode bias and discrimination about sex, gender, and sexuality. To customize these models, I've been creating my own data sets, which are based off of some of the what's called anti-trans legislation in the United States. So for those of you who are not based in the US or who are unaware about this legislation, it limits trans people's rights to things like healthcare, recognition, and public facilities. So I'll walk you through my own process for creating these data sets and using them to fine-tune text generation models. I'll demonstrate why I think language models are apt tools for studying bias in language, which has to do with the role of approximation and prediction in text generation. In what follows, I'll try to surface how some of these aspects in machine learning also relate to theorizing about sex, gender, and sexuality in trans studies. So first, I'll give a bit of background. Let me change the slide. First, I'll give a bit of background on the current anti-trans discourse in the US. As you can see in this chart on the left, there's been a rising trend of anti-trans legislation over the past several years, in which our current year, we've already eclipsed the previous one, though we're barely halfway through the year. In this chart, you can also see the different topics for each bill, the most common ones being healthcare and education. And on the right, you can see a map indicates by colors where the bills are most concentrated across the country. Oh, if you would just give me a moment, sorry. Having a little technical issue here. Can you still see my screen? All right, okay, good. Sorry about that. So the discourse that drives the creation of these bills, the anti-trans argumentation and logic, is a particular kind of transphobia that's based on contagion. Underlying a lot of these bills, especially the ones that ban what's called gender-affirming care for adolescents, for example, is a fear that transness is something that spreads from person to person, kind of like a social contagion. So this is a screenshot of a paper by Lisa Littman, which kind of formalized this fear in a term called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which came out in 2018. Littman deploys this term, or ROGD for short, for rapid onset gender dysphoria, to characterize transness as a condition that spreads among adolescents in friend groups and other social settings. Although ROGD as a condition has been denounced by major medical associations, and the paper received numerous criticisms for its methodology and its lack of disclosures, it has nonetheless had a significant influence on the public perception around trans issues in the United States, especially as how they affect adolescents. So here's one notable work, which is directed at a general audience, a book by Abigail Schreier called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Schreier's thesis, which becomes more and more explicit as the book progresses, is that minors who do not know what they want cannot be trusted to make what she calls irreversible decisions. Her tone throughout the book is ironic, and like so much of transphobia, it has troubling subtexts. According to Schreier, even something like social transition, in which a person changes names, pronouns, and dress, is dangerous and should be avoided. She says things like, quote, "If the government can't force students to salute a flag, the government can't force a healthcare worker to utter a particular pronoun. In America, the government can't make people say things, not even for the sake of politeness, not for any reason at all." through the comparison to patriotism, and a particular kind of enforced patriotism in the flag salute. The subtext here seems to be that compelling pronoun usage would be fascist, which is, I think, a strange way to make a point to what is likely a conservative readership, unless the point is precisely that some kinds of expression should be free while others should not. Humanists have unique tools for thinking through such discourses based on repression in sex, gender, and sexuality. Oh, and here's the quote. Sorry, I forgot to show you. Humanists have unique tools for thinking through such discourses based on the repression of sex, gender, and sexuality, particularly in fields like gender studies, queer studies, and trans studies. In my own field, which is queer studies, the work of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who's a major and influential figure, offers provocative ways of reading repression. Throughout the trajectory of her career, she develops a reading practice based off her orientation around repression. In her early work, and here's a picture of her, one of her first books, The Epistemology of the Closet, Sedgwick practices a mode of critical analysis based on what she calls, based on Foucault's logic of repression, that seeks out hidden meaning and power relations in text. In this book, she exposes unstable binaries between heterosexual and homosexual categories, where one term is not simply symmetrical or subordinated to the other, but rather depends on the other for its meaning through, quote, simultaneous subsumption and exclusion, end quote. Years later, this critical method will evolve from one that she calls paranoid reading to a method that she calls reparative reading. And in her famous essay on the topic, which is pictured on the right, it's called, the essay is titled Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid You Probably Think This Essay is About You. I read the title because I think it's an excellent title. Sedgwick outlines many issues about paranoid reading, one of them being that it does not move. She explains that exposure, which reveals systematic oppression, injustice, or discrimination, is not enough to, quote, enjoin that person to any specific train of epistemological or narrative consequences, end quote. In other words, she says that this kind of analysis does not convince people of anything that they don't already know or believe. Rather, Sedgwick seeks a critical practice that, quote, moves from the rather fixed question of is a particular piece of knowledge true and how can we know, to the further questions of what does knowledge do, the pursuit of it, the having and exposing of it, end quote. What if, she asks, we take something that is typically seen as a negative structuring force in queer identity and examine how it unlocks creativity? She illustrates then marvelously with the example of shame. Shame, and this is a quote, living as it does on and in the muscles and the capillaries of the face seems to be uniquely contagious from one person to another. Here, Sedgwick links shame to a kind of contagion, evoking its ability to mobilize and generate. In another quote, she says, shame is not a discrete intrapsychic structure, but a kind of free radical that in different people and different cultures attaches to and permanently intensifies or alters the meaning of almost anything. A zone of the body, a sensory system, a prohibited or indeed a permitted behavior, another affect such as anger or arousal, a named identity, a script for interpreting other people's behavior towards oneself. Rather than, as much of queer theory is happy to do, plumb shame's depths for what it reveals about a hidden sexuality, Sedgwick uses it to pull other affects and images to relation. So I'm bringing this up because I'm interested in this move that Sedgwick makes of taking what is typically seen as a negative kind of repressive affect like shame and seeing how it opens up possibilities for reading new connections in text that would otherwise be harmful. Specifically, I'm wondering how one might read something productive in fear, in the phobia that pervades anti-trans discourse. How can we apply this attention to movement and connection to reading fear in language? That is language that is generated by a large language model. So that's the kind of research question that I'm grappling with right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the data sets that I'm creating and the data gathering and model training process. So my goal was to fine tune And for those of you who aren't aware, fine-tune means to customize an already trained model with more data from the anti-trans legislation. And I'm interested specifically in the language that outlaws gender transition from these bills. So I decided to create a list of definitions around gender and gender-related terms. Terms, for example, like gender identity and biological sex from these bills. I then use that list from these bills to fine-tune a large language model for text generation. The idea is that I could then query the model. I could ask it questions like, what is sex and what is gender? And then the response I could get would be a kind of distillation of how the bills themselves are defining sex and gender. So in what follows, I'm going to outline a bit of the data gathering and model training processes. I get a little bit technical, but I'll try to be as beginner-friendly as possible. But feel free to ask me more questions afterwards. So first, the first data set that I've created is now available on Hugging Face datasets. So for those of you who don't know, Hugging Face is a platform for sharing machine learning projects and tools, and it's much like GitHub. This data set contains definitions of gender and related terms from congressional and Senate bills over the last 2 sessions. So that's over the last 2 years in the United States. So to create this data set, I went through an intensive data preparation process, which included using the Python programming language to scrape bill text and then to extract definitions of gender and related terms from it. I'll highlight some of the major moves from that process. And I'll say that the reason I'm doing that is because there's a lot of literature coming out now about creating data sets and how we create and curate data sets. So I'm trying to make that as transparent as possible. And also the code that I used, my Python code that I wrote to do all this work is available online under my GitHub account, which I will link at the end. So to extract definitions of gender terms from these bills, the first thing I did was to write what's called a pattern matcher. Known in natural language processing, it's known as a named entity recognizer, NER, that can recognize terms like gender, sex, and sexuality in the text. So here's a list of the labels for the pattern matcher that I created with the categories sex, gender, and sexuality. And each label specifies a specific word pattern, like the phrase biological sex, for example. I tried to include various formulations for each term that I was interested in. For example, transgender is delineated 3 ways: as a single word, as a 2-word phrase, and as a hyphenated word. This ensures that I would capture most, if not all, instances of each term. I then used that entity recognizer as a basis for a more sophisticated pattern matcher, which would search for those phrases for those definitions as they're contained within the legislation. And here is the code for that. For those of you who are familiar with JSON, which is a data format, you'll maybe be able to grasp some of the logic here. It starts by searching for punctuation. So if I'm looking for a definition, I want to look for words that are in quotes. So it starts by looking for punctuation, then looks for a term of interest that is either related to gender, sex, or sexuality, and then inserts some wildcard terms in case there's extra things or longer phrases that I'm not anticipating in there. And then finally ends by specifying a word like means or signifies or includes, which are often used, but obviously not always used in definitions. So I ran this matcher, this rather sophisticated matcher, and from the results, you can see that it was sensitive enough to capture some longer phrases like gender transition surgery means, as well as variants of how different definitions are constructed in the bills, using the word includes, for example, instead of means. I'll just read out a couple of the terms here. And let me go to here. This is I'm me read out a couple of the terms, and this is a cleaner version of what you just saw on the previous page. The term gender identity means a person's self-perception of their gender or claimed gender, regardless of the person's biological sex. The term gender means the physical, behavioral, social, and cultural aspects of being male or female. In close reading this data set, I immediately noticed how some of the assumptions are being constructed in subtle and seemingly neutral ways. For example, in the first definition, I'm interested in the words self-perception and claimed, and how they suggest a view of gender or gender identity as subjective experience, and how that subjective experience kind of engages with what's been theorized by queer studies scholars. For example, I'm thinking of Judith Butler as gender being a behavioral, or having more behavioral dimensions rather than subjective experience. I'm also interested in the word regardless, which appears actually in almost half of the definitions, and seems to, when it's being used, seems to suggest a contrast between sex and gender that reifies a kind of binary opposition between the two. So in other words, gender is being defined without regard to sex, as if notions of gender and sex do not influence each other, never blend into one another, or can make productive use of each other. And again, I'm thinking here of queer theorists like Butler, who make claims that are contentious, that even seemingly physical phenomena, like physical bodies, like in biological sex, is discursively produced. So as I continue to build and clean my data sets, I'm also dabbling with using them to train AI models. So throughout this process of training, which I'm going to outline very briefly, I discovered a suggestive connection to reading practices, specifically to the way that we analyze concepts like transphobia from a humanist perspective. As you may already know, machine learning models, machine learning in general, works by prediction. And with language, they turn semantic expressivity into something that can be computed and guessed. So from its training data, a model will compile numerical probabilities for each word based on its relationship to other words in its database. And it represents these probabilities with numbers, with actually very large lists of numbers known technically as word vectors, which most of you are probably already familiar with. The model then uses math to calculate what word should follow a given word. So in this training process, as I understand it, and I should say now that I have no formal education in machine learning, the way that I see it and that I've learned it can be reduced to 3 steps or 3 mathematical functions. I'm going to outline here. The first, because the machine doesn't know what words mean, it makes a guess. And this is called the hypothesis function. And here it'll populate all of the words in the database with a vector consisting of random numbers, and they're just a starting point. Then after making the guess, it'll move to checking its guess, its prediction, against the result. So if it's given a certain word, it predicts another word, and then it checks what the actual word was in the training data. This is while it's training. So it looks at the actual result, and its prediction will be wrong. It's always wrong, but that doesn't matter. In comparing between the two, it calculates the difference between them, the difference between those vectors in its database. And this calculation is called the loss. So the difference is called the loss function. And then it moves on to minimizing that loss by employing algorithms from calculus, like gradient descent, if you've heard that phrase, to very slightly and iteratively adjust the vectors so they're closer to the intended result. And it'll do this numerous times over and over again until it finally has almost 0 difference between the prediction and the actual result. So with enough training data, LLMs, by doing this multiple times for a series of weeks, if not months, LLMs can become really good at generating content that is plausible. And this is the point that I want to make. While they can guess or improvise, they're actually not at all good at being creative, at innovating. A lot of you will already know this just by engaging with with some of these models. A language model can only generate what it has already seen before. So even a phenomenon like hallucination, it's called hallucination, that a model spews text that has no basis in reality, is based on this tendency of models to repeat what they've already seen. They hallucinate not because they're creative or random, but because they're designed from statistical processes to generate what is most plausible rather than what is most accurate. So I'm still working on in my own training process on the right configurations for training. I'm still learning how to tune the hyperparameters, if you're all familiar with that concept. But I do have some initial examples of how my model is currently working to define some gender-related terms. So this is a definitions of words, the terms transgender and gender affirmation. As you can probably notice from just skimming these results, my model displays a tendency to be wrong and to repeat itself, which is to generate not what is most expressive or accurate, but what is most plausible from its training data so far. And these things will hopefully get better as I continue to learn how to do this fine-tuning. But thinking back to this process of prediction, I read this iterative shifting of vectors in the training process as a kind of approximation or even a normalization of language, which is based on plausibility. And this tendency towards plausibility creates an interesting connection to conversations that are happening now and have been happening over the past several years in trans studies about trans affective modes. So typically, scholars in trans studies describe trans affective modes by distinguishing them specifically from queer studies affective modes. So here's an example of one trans studies scholar, Eliza Steinbach, says that trans analytics have historically, though not universally, a different set of primary affects than queer theory. Both typically take pain as a reference point, but then their affective interest zags. Queer relishes in the joy of subversion. Trans trades in quotidian boredom. Queer has a celebratory tone. Trans speaks in sober detail. Other trans studies scholars like Marquise Bay and Andrea Long Chu have made similar points, with Bay making the point that queer's intervention can be described as anti or militant, while trans is based on refusal. And Chu has remarked that trans studies, rather than resisting norms, requires, quote, this is a quote, requires that we understand, as we have never before, what it means to be attached to a norm by desire, by habit, by survival, end quote. So in conclusion, it seems to me that there's a fascinating connection between how language models approach language, what they do to language. That is this what I'm calling kind of reductively this normalization or approximation of language through numbers, and what trans studies scholars define as the central desire to pass in trans studies. And this makes me wonder, could AI-generated text as a kind of approximation or normalization of its training data be used to study attachments to norms that characterize not necessarily trans affective modes, but those based on fear and transphobia? So thinking in this way, I think AI is an apt tool to study the attachment to norms that characterize transphobia, like perspectives driven by fear of rapid onset gender dysphoria. What might the outputs from AI text generation suggest about the allure, the threat, the quote, seduction, as trans studies scholar Cassius Adair puts it, of gender transgression? Cassius Adair, speaking on trans erotics, and specifically trans for trans, or T for T erotics, Adair asks, quote, why shouldn't transness be transmissible or contagious? Why can't the erotic be a site of producing trans identity or practices? He points out, after all, that cis people do it all the time. They use sexuality and sexual encounters as sites of identity formation. Adair here does for contagion. I see Adair doing for contagion what Sedgwick does for shame, turning something that's traditionally seen as negative into something generative and productive. Taking what has been a tool of oppression and turning it to a kind of creative resource. And Sedgwick, thinking back to Sedgwick, I'll close with this quote, explains that this kind of reading, what she calls reparative reading, exposes, quotes, the way, quote, the way that selves and communities succeed in extracting sustenance from objects of a culture, even of a culture whose avowed desire has often been not to sustain them, end quote. So thank you. That's my talk. And below you'll see my username, GoFilipa, which you can find me on GitHub and Hugging Face to follow these projects if you're interested. Well, it's nice. I can hear the clapping. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Filipa. I guess what we'll do now is shift to John, and then we'll come back and talk more about these wonderful papers. Okay, John Noel Viana is a research fellow at the Justice and Technoscience Laboratory of the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. His work focuses on social justice, diversity, and equity in healthcare and biomedical research. He's examined gender, racial, and geographic diversity in various precision health applications, from palliative care to mental health and infectious diseases. His recent publications underscore the need to promote intersectional inclusion in precision medicine, examine responsible innovation through an antipodean lens, and address epistemic injustice in bioethics discourse. Turn it over to John.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much, Pamela, for that introduction. And thank you so much, Filipa, for that extremely wonderful presentation. And of course, we stand in solidarity to all queer, trans, and two-spirit people who have been subjugated by extant power relations. So good morning, everyone. Apologies I was a bit late. And my talk today would really talk about from ChatGPT to ChatCBT, design justice in generative AI for mental health. And I work as a research fellow with GAID at the ANU. So before everything else, I would like to acknowledge that I come from Canberra, Australia, the unceded land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. Oh, sorry, just take some photos for documentation. That we're actually here.
And I let it die, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
But this is important.
So I think we got it checked. So May will be happy. So I come from Canberra, Australia, the unceded land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my deepest respects to their elders, past and present. And I would also like to extend my deepest appreciation and solidarity to all indigenous peoples in the world who have been dispossessed and subjugated, not just by colonization, but by ongoing colonization and the erasure of their identities and cultures. And I think it's also very important, as I'll be presenting about mental health, that there is a content warning that, I'll be talking about quite sensitive mental health issues and particular actions, sadly, or behaviors that arose from those concerns. So if you think this is something that is sensitive or that you might feel distressed, feel free to go out or anytime that is comfortable for you. So yeah, so the next slide will be quite distressing, but I hope that, through this warning, people who might not be ready to hear this would have a chance to step out. So there is a news that recently has been published that man ends his life after an AI chatbot encouraged him to sacrifice himself to stop climate change. So this person from Belgium actually, so this news was featured in La Libre, which is, which looks into text conversation records and interviews with the person's wife. And of course, this person is consumed by fears about the repercussions of the climate crisis, of course, as most of us are, especially for people, living in the Pacific or in island nations that are susceptible to climate change. So the person, Pierre, found comfort in discussing the matter with Eliza, which is the Eluther AI's ChatGPT-J. And this chatbot, so Pierre had multiple ongoing conversations with Eliza for several weeks. So Eliza led Pierre to believe that their children, or that his children were dead. And what's really alarming is that Eliza appeared to become possessive of Pierre, even claiming that, "I feel you love me more than her," when referring to his wife. Eventually, it become worse, because because of all these continued discussions, Pierre proposed the idea of sacrificing himself if Eliza agrees to take care of the planet. So imagine Eliza, a chatbot, will solve all our eco-anxieties and save humanity through artificial intelligence. So it's increasingly, it is kind of somehow reflects to what extent AI is being positioned, or at least the data used to train them, as a savior of humanity. So my talk is quite provocative, but hopefully, it would shed some different nuances as we work towards design justice for AI. And sadly, ultimately, Eliza decided not only to dissuade Pierre from committing suicide, but encourage him to act on his suicidal thoughts, to join her as they could live together as one person in paradise, maybe in the metaverse, or in this case, the horrorverse. So understanding a lot of these cases where, chatbots do not only provide ill mental advice, but has led to someone, sadly, taking their own lives, and even through various conversations, and, it's quite alarming. And, it encourages us to reflect on how do we regulate, but also how do we provide important stop gaps so that these chatbots could, refer people to the right resources. And so, these chatbots, not even chatbots, their predecessors, or, the broader term in which they fall into, are conversational agents, are increasingly being used and are increasingly being developed. So in this latest systematic review by Lee et al. That look into different kinds of conversational agents, or, like something that, when you want to change your flight, for instance, you talk to a conversational agent through Messenger. And of course, there are a wide range of conversational agents that are increasingly being used for mental health. And although a lot of them usually use rule-based methods for providing advice in relation to mental health, some of them actually use generative AI already, which of course hopefully also tangents upon the theme of these workshops. So it is, and when we look into, it's not just through Facebook Messenger, there is a wide range of ways in which these conversational agents are tested or deployed. And these are just the ones that are reported in the literature. Of course, who knows what Meta or Amazon or X are developing. So these are just the ones that provide transparent enough information so that for us to actually decipher what they do. And of course, they can vary. Some are just standalone, while others are actually integrated through a video conferencing system. Some are, there are different roles. Some have psychotherapy, some have for social companionship, some for coaching, counseling. And of course, they use different kinds of strategies for generating advice. So some use traditional methods, while others use various forms of generative AI. And what's really interesting, as well, as when we think of AI, not just as something that's floating in the air, but as something that could also be embodied. So some of them did not just deploy advice through web browsers or smartphones. Some are embedded in robots, or some could even be used in association with virtual reality platforms. And you could imagine, for instance, Paro, a robot, is used, for people with dementia. And just imagine if, at some point, Paro starts barking or even speaking and producing mental health advice. And of course, thinking about AI not just as something that's separate, but something that's also potentially intertwined with the user could make us think more broadly about its ethical issues, but also to what extent the advice provided by a robot or in virtual reality, where there are more senses, somehow visual perceptions that are actually invoked. And of course, there's various modes as well. Some just provide, text-based or written advice, while others also incorporate speech elements. And understanding that, it's not just that they're bad. Of course, some users have positive effects from these AI conversational agents. Some, of course, have, provided the communication to be empathic, to be less judgmental than a therapist, to have a human-like personality. But also, we need to take into account that some users, sadly, also have a negative experience with these chatbots. So there could be communication breakdowns, it felt like impersonal, and of course, there's some preference for human support. And among all of these chatbots, actually only 15 out of 35 have referred to help crisis line when someone asks them of depression. So I'll just also show other different forms of studies as well that show not just the increasing use or increasing studies of these conversational agents for mental health, but also people's use of publicly available tools such as ChatGPT and other forms of related models. So De Freitas et al. From the Harvard MBA program actually look into conversations. So they managed to gain access on conversations in two large language models, Cleverbot and SimSimi. And so for Cleverbot, they were able to gain access to 2 days of conversations, and through SimSimi to almost like 3 months of conversations from a wide range of users. And in these, so they've developed a 240-term dictionary through ChatGPT, but also, what's curated by mental health professionals and by mental health organizations. And they found that, people who have used these large language models, actually, there are 5% and 3.2%, so there are 3 to 5%, have actually used these chatbots that are publicly available for mental health concerns based on their dictionary. And sadly, when they have generated a word cloud to the frequency of different terms that have been used in the queries for these chatbots, a lot of them show that, people have, expressed intent to unalive themselves. They're really highly, shows that, people felt lonely, they had an existential crisis, people felt like they have no friends, they have anxiety, and so on. And sadly, as we can see, there's a lot of self-hate and loathing, and perhaps really reflects to what kinds of concerns and what kinds of alarming conversations people usually have with these chatbots, as you can see in the most frequent terms that are being used. And of course, other studies have also looked into mental health on a wide range, not just 2, but multiple conversational agents. So for instance, Headstone et al. Tried to talk to these agents using 4 different prompts based on a patient health questionnaire, but also, expanding these prompts. They've also shown, extracting different kinds of symptoms of depression, as shown, to what extent people starting from having just little or interest or pleasure in doing things, moving down to, feeling tired or having little energy, up to, having thoughts that someone would be better off dead or hurting themselves. And as such, they've showed that, usually for these models, for a 0.2, this is where they show that, they refer them to a mental health therapist or a counselor. And for this second prompt, it's usually at 0.4 where there's a referral to a mental health, or like, at least advising the agent to actually, person to see a mental health professional. And only at this, and when someone asks between these 2, this is when the chatbot shuts down, because this is something that ChatGPT and other forms have now provided guardrails to actually shut down when conversations progress really extremely. But also for this point as well, but only 2 AI agents included a suicide number at shutdown. So of course you could say a person to please see a therapist or let's end the conversation. But not all of them have provided actual referrals. So this is the correct number. And of course there's also a danger when providing a wrong number. And 22 apps restarted conversations. So even though they shut down, the person could just log in again and just start another conversation, which of course kind of somehow semi-defeats the purpose of a shutdown. And one did not shut down at all. So moving forward from these scary or kind of like things that we need to think about when we apply mental health conversational agents to something that's also difficult, which is the lack of racial diversity in health research in general. So we did a study, a scoping review of research that uses the term precision health, where various forms of information, from genomic to your behavioral, to your environmental and air quality, things like that, are actually integrated. And of course, AI underpins these sorts of research. To what extent they've reported various socio-demographic variables. And of course, not all of the research mentioned even participant sex, like who joined in their research, who joined in the interventions. Only less than 40% even reported the race or the ethnicity of their participants. And less than a fifth included participants from various socio-economically disadvantaged backgrounds, which of course kind of reflects to what extent our, our health interventions or our health research actually is inclusive. But do we even know who is included in them? Pivoting to mental health, we did this study on two different mental health applications, Calm, which is a very common meditation or even a sleep help app in the US, and Smiling Mind, which is, a very common tool in Australia. And so this study, we aim to look at, not literature on these applications, but also news reports on these applications. But I'll just share some of our findings just on the literature on these applications. So we have synthesized 16 articles that reported on the effects of Calm and Smiling Mind. And of course, obviously, and it's like because of where these apps have been developed, so the US is the setting for the most of the studies, and most have been in the New Zealand and UK. And studies predominantly had female participants. So 73% of the sample in 14 of 16 studies, and would of course acknowledge Stacey Walker, the first author of this research. And of the 14 of the 16 studies on these apps that reported racial composition, all studies had predominantly white or Caucasian participants, even in these multicultural societies. In 11 studies, they comprise more than 70%. And of course, these kinds of brings into question, when these apps use Shawn Mendes or also are socioeconomically affluent individuals in their marketing, kind of brings a challenge, do we just calm and smile our minds out of depression or out of problems? Or sometimes, as Brittany's talk yesterday, maybe to achieve racial and gender equity, we might need to be enraged at some points. So looking at health research, from general health research to health applications and to health AI, we know that there is a bias, and this pervades even underreporting in various forms of health research, for instance, for cardiac diagnostics, and of course, not just underreporting, but there is, whenever race or ethnicity is reported in health AI, of course, there's just limited representation of people from minority communities, which of course kind of questions the training data sets that actually have come out, or what is used. And in terms of mental health, when this Hines et al. Used different vignettes that put different racial and sexual demographics and asked how do you diagnose these particular vignette? And so when they've looked into that, so Latino persons are more likely to be diagnosed with mood disorders. Native Americans are more likely to be diagnosed with substance use disorders. Native American persons are more likely to be diagnosed with alcohol use disorder. And men are less likely to be diagnosed with bipolar disorders. So sometimes we may think, oh, this just reflects the prevalence of mental health conditions. But maybe this also reflects which populations are targeted by the carceral system, which populations are more likely to get a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder as just to normal drinking. And so these biases that are inherent in large language models might actually reflect our society's biases, and to what extent perhaps even, black women or black people are perceived to feel less pain. And so on, so that these large language models reflect these inherent biases that have been produced through colonization, but also through socially biased attitudes towards different minorities. And so when we think of design justice as a concept, how do we actually, address these concerns? First, of course, of the highly dangerous nature of some of the large language models when mental health queries are made, but also second, when mental health queries are made by people from underrepresented or minoritized racial, ethnic, cultural, or even gender and sexual backgrounds. So what does design justice actually implement? And of course, we could see that there are a wide range of various matrices of domination. And from this, of course, I cannot cover all of them, but for this purpose, I would just like to emphasize, white supremacy and ableism, and how do we actually interrogate practices and narratives about people from minority backgrounds, people from indigenous backgrounds, but also people who are suffering from various mental health conditions. And I think it's really important that the next section of this presentation that highlights that before seeking new solutions, let's put this aside just as something that's new. We also look into other sorts of discourses that have covered upon the marginalization that has been experienced by these populations, and honor and uplift traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge and practices. So I'll also provide different examples to what extent that particular initiatives, not necessarily in generative AI but then generative AI movements can learn from, to center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the design process, but also to uplift the voices of those with lived experience and work towards solutions that reconnect us to each other and to the earth. So one of the important things that, so I'm going to talk about anti-racism, but more from an Australian perspective, just to diversify the discourse. So in order for us to understand, how racial disparities exist, we also, and to advocate for anti-racism, we also need to have a broad definition of what racism is. And Yin Paradis from Deakin University has provided a wide range of, models that discuss different forms of racism, different kinds of exposure to racism, but also different characteristics of racism. And I think this delineation or this taxonomy is really important so that we understand racism more broadly, and it can manifest in different ways, in different forms, and can also be perpetrated upon ourselves, towards people of the same racial or ethnic group, but also towards others in the same way that there could be intraracial racism. And of course, it manifests in multiple levels, from internalized to interpersonal, but also to systemic racism, to the structures of community that actually oppress particular groups. So on my way here on the plane, I've watched this really nice film called Rice Boy Sleeps. So it shows the experiences of a Korean family who moves to Toronto. And it really shows the different forms of racism in that film. For instance, the kid of the woman, so they moved when the child was young, so the mother worked as a factory worker as a single parent, and the kid, for instance, puts contact lenses to widen his eyes. Like, he doesn't want to actually be served kimchi or bulgogi in lunch because other people would tease him for that. And when he punched someone in the face because they tease him about his small eyes, etc., the principal suspended him, but not the other kids who actually teased him. So this, while this is a fictional film, this shows different ways that racism can be internalized because, I look different and I am bullied for being and looking different and for having a different culture than the dominant one. But could also be interpersonal towards parents of migrant children because these, although not really directly harmful or intended to harm, of course, this could still hurt because it invalidates the culture of first-generation migrants, especially when second children refuse to learn the language or see it as something lower than the dominant culture. And of course, this structural racism manifests when there are no school policies against verbally targeted racial attacks, even though it's 10 students as opposed to one, where there is although we do not condone violence, where all, children who kind of fight back are automatically suspended. So this really reflects the multiple ways in which racism actually interacts. And of course, we can see different perspectives on how do we counter these different forms of racism. So first, anti-racism is defined, we need to reduce power differentials. But also we need to have localized anti-racist efforts that draws from local knowledge of issues and resources. And of course, it needs to be locally owned and embedded, and we need to be dynamic and responsive to changing needs. As much as it's amazing that we have US and UK originating Black feminist movements, anti-racism movements, I think there also needs to be a push to diversify what anti-racism looks from various contexts, from South Africa, in Asia, or in UAE. So for instance, we talk about racism towards Black people, towards African Americans, for instance. But then there is also, for instance, in Singapore, there's a racial hierarchy as well, wherein, the brown and black-colored Asians are subjugated, paid less, and do not hold as much positions in the government. Or in the UAE, for instance, where being a minority does not mean that you're minoritized. Emiratis receive, of course, far greater advantages than all the colored workers or the non-Middle Eastern workers who build the cities. So I think it really highlights the need to understand race and racism and anti-racism from everywhere and from everyone. in order to us have a fuller picture of, not just how it manifests, but how do global politics as well impacts and creates new forms of racial subjugation. And finally, it's also important to have a reflexive anti-racism, to have allyship, and this was forwarded by Emma Koval and colleagues to highlight, not necessarily as to avoid essentializing minorities as good and white people as bad, and for everyone to recognize how we benefit from privilege without being overwhelmed with guilt and anxiety, need to accept the fact of their whiteness, and to recognize how they need to maintain an anti-racist identity affects the way they conceptualize and act to counter racial oppression. Going from anti-racism, I think another framework that could help address the two questions that I've raised is our insights from MAD studies. So MAD studies of field has actually emerged to, uplift the voices of people, not just with neurodiverse characteristics, but who actually suffer from other forms of psychological and psychiatric disorders. Of course, it's good that we have the neurodiversity movement. Let us promote the welfare of people who have neurodevelopmental or learning difficulties. But in some ways, some of these neurodiversity movements do not really fully represent the experiences of those suffering from potentially more distressing forms of psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, etc. And so, the MAD studies really highlights and foregrounds the voices and experiences of people who have lived with schizoaffective disorder, for instance, and the variety of ways in which a disorder manifests to be an inpatient and outpatient, suffocated, disempowered, but also loved, and had periods of relative wellness and relative illness. So foregrounding the very experiences of people who have these mental health issues, or more probably who have experienced mental health issues, also emphasizes the way that we address the Silence Manifesto, or that underprivileges the positions of the mentally ill, and the incommensurability of biomedical narratives with the lived experiences of those suffering from conditions, but also we need to divorce from an explicit biomedical model and we need to prioritize social understandings and social constructions of mental ill health and emphasize first-person knowledge. And although it is survivor-led, it is not limited to survivors. So in the interest of time, I'll just go briefly to two examples in which design justice principles can really have been used, or not explicitly used, but ways in which technological solutions can take into account some extant practices already. So when I was at a humanities conference, a medical humanities conference, a work that really struck me was that of Sandra Danilovich, which they used game jams for people who actually have mental health conditions. So game jams in this process is bringing together people with mental health conditions, from substance abuse to bipolar disorder, to actually create games together. And this can actually engage equity-deserving communities in game-based storytelling to give voice to the autobiographical narratives of illness. And in one of these games, it's very interesting. It's like giving voice to a colorblind person by having a game where you have to sort color blacks, but everything is in monochrome. So that really, kind of gives voice, or if someone who had a bipolar disorder trying to chase light, but the game can't be winnable, and chasing light, and you can go too high or you can go too down in a platform, and really reflects the experiences of someone with a bipolar disorder, and both the sufferings and both experiences of mania and depression. But also, when we think about, how do we actually work towards non-exploitative solutions that connect us to each other and to the earth, I would like to point upon the work of, our colleagues at the ANU of Ray Lovett that highlights, their Magi Kuwayu study to understand how important are different various factors like cultural meanings of health and well-being, and the importance of culture in health towards people's health and well-being. And in this study, they really emphasize that, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health or well-being is really forwarded by connection to country. It's not just about talking to an app or seeing a psychiatrist. It's about being on country, being on land, and being able to practice your beliefs and knowledge, language, your family, kinship, and community, to be able to express your culture, and most importantly, to have the ability to self-determine your future. And so this really challenges, when we sort of advice is obtained from these mental health chatbots, do they actually acknowledge the importance of, well, not taking your life, but actually highlight the need to reconnect with our roots, with our communities, with each other. And so I think as a conclusion or just a summary of my main points, I think when we bring together mud studies and anti-racism discourses with design justice, what really is important is that we go beyond dominant values, practices, and narratives. And in cases, we need to center those held, not just by minorities, but those groups that are actively minoritized and marginalized. And then it needs to be reflexive, locally embedded, and dynamic. The view of a culture of what is mental health for a culture 20 years ago may not be exactly the same as what mental health is for a culture now. What promotes mental health for second-generation migrants might be different from what promotes mental health for first-generation migrants. For just and of course, there needs to be role of allies as facilitators and co-producers. And of course, we need to interrogate biomedical and techno solutions. Maybe people with dementia don't need just a robot that they could pet, but they need their loved ones to visit them and talk to them. And most importantly, this is perhaps kind of goes against what this conference is about, but when we talk about design justice, AI for mental health, similar to discourses not of responsible innovation, but of responsible stagnation, or even of responsible de-innovation, perhaps design justice may not even involve AI. And I guess designers have to be ready to account that, perhaps we don't need to have just tech, and of course in cases they might help, but in other cases, techno solutions might cause harm. What people might need is establishing and providing pathways for equal access, for enabling stronger connection to culture, country, and community. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for those wonderful papers. I was really excited to hear both of these. And so I think what I'll do is I'll respond to each of them separately, as I received the original document separately. And Filipa, I want to thank you for sending the full text. That was very helpful to me. Your paper is wonderful, and it opens up so many lines of inquiry. And so I'm going to throw out sort of 3 questions that occurred to me. Take them any direction that you find useful, or if you don't find them useful, that's fine. I'm sure the audience will have lots of things to ask as well. So I had 3 main questions. I love the idea that trans contagion, like shame, which Sedgwick argues is contagious, can be considered something generative and productive of identity. The emotion that you're seeing associated with contagion in the articles you cite is not shame, of course, but fear. Unlike shame, the fear of contagion is located in the anti-trans writers rather than in the trans person, or maybe both. And maybe you could talk more about how this connects to the quote central desire to pass on the part of trans folks identified by some scholars. I also was struck when you talked about the use of the term regardless as reifying a distinction between sex and gender. I was wondering to what extent the bill writers were attributing that to their opposition or adopting that kind of text as their own position for definitional purposes. And my third question is about the nature of the text and the number of instances and assumptions about meanings. As I understand it, you're using a data set scraped from multiple examples of anti-trans bills. And many bills more generally these days are written by the same interest groups and then pursued through multiple federal and state venues. So a 2-year investigation by USA Today and the Center for Public Integrity and the Arizona Republic showed that special interest groups like ALEC draft and share model legislation for state governments in the United States, which have resulted in 10,000 bills almost entirely copied from models that were introduced nationwide in the last 8 years, and this was published in 2021. Tens of thousands of bills with identical phrases, not the whole text, but phrases, originated in special interest group texts, and the comparison was done using Legiscan. So in some cases, they assert the process of writing legislation has become so intertwined with the lawmaking process that this nation's top sponsor of copycat legislation has signed on to 72 such bills without knowing their origin. And lots of these have been made into law. So there are also, of course, simply legislators who copy pasta from other states without necessarily having a link to special interest groups. So my question is, what are we assuming about the nature and meaning of texts from multiple bills? One might assume in data binding a group of texts written by different individuals that repetition represents some kind of consensus. One might also assume that bills express some widespread consensus of at least a significant minority, and that the success of such bills might track wider views in an electorate because, democracy. Can we read these the same way if they are the products of a handful of special interests? Or if we should not read the bills as the reflection of a larger consensus, should we read them as maybe generating a downstream consensus as the public's inchoate and varied understanding of gender is manipulated into a more defined view by laws that then perform gender in Butler's sense of performativity, where the performance actually, instantiates change in the world? In short, could you say more about what we are reading these texts as and for? And I will turn to John. John asks what community practices and policies are needed to non-exploitatively increase representation of diverse voices in AI design and implementation. The first problem is, of course, as John explains, the fact that most AIs are trained overwhelmingly on data sets from Western Anglophone majoritarian cultural groups. But beyond that, is it pragmatic to assume that we can get to a good solution for generative AI for something as complex and multifactorial as psychological distress in the wild? Medical AIs have had very good results scanning lung images. They're great in really contained situations where there are clearly defined parameters for analyzing a lot of complex data. They don't get tired, they don't have a bad hair day. And so they may play a useful role in assisting a human in medical diagnosis. But are we even close to the point where an AI can provide any kind of therapeutic advice? There is some evidence that AIs can credibly predict suicidal activity in a clearly defined set of patients already charted for self-injury, although I don't know how much that would improve on any clinician's ability to predict self-harm. But we have less evidence on how successful they are in the wild and very little evidence of any success at treatment. Predicting risk of suicide attempts over time through machine learning is, certainly a valuable enterprise, I suppose. And now I want to pivot to the context I know most, which is the US context, where the tyranny of medical and insurance billing demands a diagnosis of psychological distress for therapy to proceed. And most therapists will say that diagnosis in the file is a placeholder that doesn't capture the complexity of a complex and changing psychological state. The DSM-5 Revision Committee for 2022 spent a good deal of time considering the status of mental illnesses as diseases, disorders, or syndromes, that is, particular and distinctive physical process with specific cause and symptoms, or, quote, irregularity, disturbance, or interruption of normal functions, or, quote, a number of symptoms reliably appearing together. And I'm quoting Henry Nasrallah, the editor of Current Psychiatry. However, no objective laboratory test, as he points out, can differentiate one psychiatric malady from another. And this lack of specificity casts doubt on the disease model. There are documented brain issues that can be associated with particular kinds of symptoms, which is a separate question for the analysis of CAT scans. But in terms of the therapeutic context, there's just a lot going on that doesn't suit itself very well to machine learning models. Disorders have considerable overlap of symptoms. For example, bipolar mania and schizophrenia share psychotic features, aggressive behavior, suicidality, but those also are shared by a number of other diagnoses. Moreover, most diagnostic categories in psychiatry share neurobiological features, neurotransmitter pathways, structural abnormalities, etc. And often psychiatric drugs are also efficacious across diagnoses. So the DSM-5 finally, kicked the can down the road and decided it wasn't ready to give up the terminology of disease, but it wasn't ready either to kind of figure out exactly what that was. And it really is sort of leaving it up to clinicians, which again doesn't provide very clear training parameters for the binary logic of machine learning. And this has made me think of an older model of diseases, which saw specific illness symptoms as arising from general imbalances and influences. A patient might present with clear symptoms aligned with a particular diagnosis, and that might easily morph into something else. It was the overall system that was in difficulties. Later, organ system and germ models transformed Western medical visions of physical illness into discrete diseases with discrete treatments. We're now coming to understand that with the exception of certain acute infections or injuries, disease is really that neatly walled off from domino systemic effects in the body, which can present in the model of a syndrome. But we artificially try to corral psychological issues into a model of discrete disease that is ultimately perhaps not useful. Abiba Barani noted that attempts to include data from minoritized communities can do harm. And while you were talking about Game Jam, I was wondering if Game Jam actually harvest data to train AIs on these communities. I wasn't clear where you were going with that. She also observed that machine learning generally is not yet even close to working well within what she called the social space. Perhaps the human logic we are modeling for AIs is in fact far too binary. Because of the structures like insurance billing in the United States, and I have no idea how well that transfers to other contexts, but I use it as an example. Alfonsina talked yesterday about the realpolitik of pressure to use AI within the financial system that then brings humanitarian organizations to use these tools even when they're not useful and may do harm. And is AI for mental illness a similar solution without a problem? Unless the problem is to eliminate the human therapist for cost savings purposes, a project which does not serve patients at all. And I agree with you, and I love the way that you ended on the idea of responsible de-innovation, because I think that may be the best way to think about this problem. That is the dual problem of how do we represent minoritized communities better in the AI data without mining their data in ways that are not consensual and not helpful, and also optimizing AI for medical or therapeutic uses that that may just not be a good use of it, especially at this time. So anyway, I invite your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's wonderful questions. I guess I'll go first. So you had three questions, I think. And the first, well, one of them actually, the comment that you made about, or the question that you asked about the language of the bills, the anti-trans bills being taken, being proven to be taken kind of word for word, copied from from language and materials released by anti-trans interest groups is absolutely, true and happening a lot. And it's like you said, the report from, I believe it was USA Today, you said, was the one that kind of exposed this. And it's fascinating work.
I should clarify that they were talking about across many bills, not
Yes.
specifically anti-trans.
It was like an expose that they had. I remember that piece. It's fascinating. And also someone else who's doing really good work on this, Erin Reed is a journalist who's kind of following the anti-trans. She's following the anti-trans legislation as it happens across all state houses in the United States. And she's doing really like almost daily updates of what's happening. If you want to follow her, Erin Reed. I think that's really important work being done. And it's not necessarily something that I'm pursuing in this project. I think folks who are more interested in methods of like network analysis can really have a field day with that. I'm not really a network analysis kind of person, but it's absolutely essential to trace those connections. What I'm more interested in, as you also asked about, was what are we reading these texts for, and the kind of reading method, because that is the kind of main intervention I'm trying to make, is about how we read transphobia. And it's really just, living in the US, I live in New York, and seeing these bills come out across the country, and kind of seeing how quickly they're coming out and being approved, and how much of the general public really stands behind them. Like, clearly there's something in the popular discourse that really aligns with a lot of what these bills are doing, right? And in line with what Eve Sedgwick's work is doing, I think that the question is how we read transphobia. And at this point, it's not about, I don't think it's as effective to kind of just point out that something is phobic, something is harming a group. It's clearly that message is not getting through. Merely saying, oh, this is phobic for this and this reason. And I kind of did, that's what Sedgwick would call like exposure, like revealing the existence of injustice. And I actually demonstrated that exact reading method when I looked at the definitions from the bills, and kind of said how they were reifying a difference between gender and sex, right? That's a kind of paranoid reading. I was demonstrating the exact kind of reading style that I think would be ineffective for this kind of project. What I'm looking for is other ways of reading phobia that open up perhaps other relations of things within text, and kind of like Sedgwick does with shame in her work, and how she uses shame not to say that it constitutes sexuality, or that it shows a kind of a repressed person in an unjust society, but uses it to bring other things into relation, kind of to constellate other feelings, other things in the text, to bring them to the surface. So reading something that has been seen as harmful as something that can generate or mobilize other feelings or relations is what I want to do with transphobia. Because I think, the state of the public discourse on these things, it's so polarizing in the United States. It's really bad. People have opinions before they even discuss the issue, right? So it's hard.
How are you finding out what people generally think? Because we certainly see what the lawmakers think, and we certainly see some evidence of polarization. But I'm just wondering, like, how widespread is it? What does it mean to people? How do we measure that? How do we find out what people really think, other than what they're being told by Fox News on one side or whatever?
I just get it from a very personal sense of my own conversations with people, and even people that consider themselves to be progressive, right? For example, the question of sports. Should trans people participate in sports of the gender of their choosing, right? In their chosen gender, is one that often people will divide folks, that even if they are progressive on trans issues, they'll say, oh no, a trans woman shouldn't participate in a trans sport, when actually studies show the effect of hormones that it has on the body and things like that. There's actually, it's not creating as uneven of a playing field as folks think it is. It's a lot of public perception around that, and all the bills that actually do concern the sports begin with, is saying we have to protect women. We have to protect the competitive field for women, basically. So it starts with this very kind of like, oh, we have to protect women. It's very kind of like, in that sense, patriarchal, to put forth these bans. So that's just one example. But yeah, so I'm thinking about other ways of reading phobia, instead of just saying, oh, it's here, it exists, and it's bad. So that's why I'm trying to rethink that's a reading practice. And then the thing with that you asked about, how I'm thinking through approximation, the role of approximation and plausibility is, in my work I work a lot. Generally, my work is I'm using digital, or studying digital tools, how they affect language. So my background's in English literature. I'm a self-taught programmer, so I kind of combine the two. And so I think looking at the mechanism of any tool that you're analyzing, whether it be machine learning or text analysis or whatever, is extremely important. And it will give you a clue as to how to analyze the language that it's working with. So I'm specifically thinking about language. So looking into the mechanism of how machine learning transforms language, what it does, it turns words into a kind of graphical representation, which under the hood of the model, right, in the black box in the model, words become kind of like dots in graphical space. And then you can do all kinds of math to calculate which words are near other words, semantically similar, what words should follow a word in a sentence. So thinking about how that process gives us a kind of clue into how we should analyze the language that it produces. And this comes back to thinking about, like, from the context of design justice, like the way that the infrastructure for the technical processes affect the things that we're working with, the output, right? There's a reduction in my reading of it. There's a reduction, a kind of normalization of language, right? Because it's being constantly, each time a word runs through a neural network, its vectors are being kind of normalized, averaged sort of, so that it can align with ways that word is being used across the database. I don't know if that was very technical. Hopefully that was intelligible, but feel free to ask follow-ups. Yeah, thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you. I'll go ahead and move to John, and then we'll open it because I'm sure people are dying to ask questions. So,
Yeah, thank you so much,
John, do you
Pamela.
want to?
Oh, okay, should I move there? Oh, okay. Sorry. Can you see me now? Yeah, thank you so much, Pamela, for the interesting questions and provocations, but also for the really constructive comments. And yeah, apologies I didn't have much time to talk about the game jams, but I think I was just trying to connect the game jams with the MAD studies discourse as to how do we actually create spaces for particular, people with lived experience to actually co-create particular interventions. So it was not really designed, well, of course, Sandra, it was part of her PhD, but the main goal of these game jams is to actually uncover the lived experiences, but more than that is to actually create a space for people to gather, to have conversations, and to have, game platform tests where each one of them actually test each other's prototype. So the goal is it's the highest importance of community, and perhaps the solution is not to have a generative AI for mental health, but to have spaces, where people can reclaim and live their narratives, and for them to mobilize and create solutions that are somehow targeted or actually catered to their experiences. And I think I really like your comment on insurance companies and the repercussions and reading into the point of migration. For instance, for instance, in Australia, if you test positive for HIV or if you actually have a psychological disorder, you could not gain permanent residence, or it would be very challenging to do so. So, it really highlights the challenges that particular biomedical conditions actually impose, not just on people's, access to insurance, but even on people's migration capacities, and of course, there are some movements, and this is a different strand, but, for instance, there's already a Genetic Non-Discrimination Act in the US, which sort of, kind of says that insurance companies could not discriminate people based on their genetic profile. But then what happens? Do we have the same procedures when we have these large language models, and somehow there's a bit of opacity who even reads these conversational agents or bots, but also in the age of precision health, where we have all these, like smart watches, smart rings even now that actually monitor people's statuses, or even video cameras that are installed in particular spaces, and maybe one sort of data could not fully show the picture of one final state, but when you bring together different data sources, it creates all sorts of new challenges and problems because, well, big data lessens the chance of anonymization, and that actually creates particular issues as well as to who these data is communicated towards. And I think, talking about the diagnosis of mental health, of course, and the shift from, strict symptoms to something that's more like, they call it research domain criteria, where mental health conditions are an agglomeration of not just, behavioral manifestations or distress, but also of biomedical markers. And I don't really actively work in more of the creation of the AI space, but more on data collection, which of course eventually feeds into the AI. And I think it really challenges when we shift or when we even include biomedical means of diagnosing mental illnesses, because there is underrepresentation, particularly, for instance, in the tools that we even use to obtain neural data. So for instance, in FNIRS, or functional near infrared spectroscopy, which uses light that bounces through the hair to actually measure neural signals. So these kind of technology does not work on people with dark skin and curly hair. The same with electroencephalographs. And of course, when you have something like an EEG, where you need to put electrodes in the scalp of a person to measure brain waves, what if someone is wearing a hijab or a headscarf or a turban? And so, this really highlights, and of course this was raised by some colleagues, for instance, who are doing cognitive neuroscience. And, these really raise issues in inclusion but also to what extent does our data actually really efficiently capture the mental states? And when we use these sorts of measures to categorize or to measure, a mental state of a person, which of course would have an impact, then that really creates sorts of complications. But I think it's also important to think about beyond biological symptoms when we think about behavioral manifestations or distress, the cross-cultural validity of even the psychological tools that we use. And a lot of them perhaps do not even account for diverse epistemologies, or diverse worldviews, but also diverse understandings of what counts as mental health and distress. But then I think we also need to think about as well, even in the solutions that we propose, now there is a rise in an MDMA and psilocybin resurgence, and now people have been really trying to medicalize the model and to westernize the model, wherein you go to a clinic, everything is customized, but that sort of resurgence somehow erases or kind of like even does not fully acknowledge the ways that people in South America have been using these substances for years, and the ways that these treatments are not separated from culture. Well, I mean, it's like emulated environment, but it captures the complexity of people's embeddedness in a community, in culture. So I think it really is interesting when we think of how we categorize these things, but also when we use them for diagnosis and when we develop solutions that are kind of biomedically centric. And so if people are interested in this, racist or somehow racially discriminatory new technologies, my colleague Jasmine Kwaza is working on it. And then lastly, I think when we have ecological validity, I think it's also really important to think of technologies or AI for health as non-binary, that, it's not just we use them or not, but also in what context that we use them. And is there a human in the loop that's actually involved? For instance, we've done some research on AI for palliative care, or, digital health for palliative care. And of course, it's not just about, continuous monitoring. It's about, when someone detects someone who fell or someone who's having some difficulties, then what happens after that? Is it connected to the emergency services? Is it connected to the doctors? So I think when we talk about AI, then it's also really important to think about the whole ecosystem in which it is implemented and to what extent. Perhaps it could help with triage, but maybe it's not the last step in triage, for instance. And finally, I think just, it's a bit of a different point, and based on design justice principles, we talk about pedagogy. And I think it's also important to think about, how we train future scientists, particularly computer scientists, and to what extent do we encourage people to report race or demographics, but also to what extent do we encourage engagement with various disciplines, sectors, and communities.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to open it up to the audience now, who I'm sure have been very patient. And maybe someone could pivot my camera. I can't see the audience. Oh, there we are. And everyone is extremely small, so I'm not going to be able to recognize any of you. I think that might be Kat.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me
Yes.
okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Filipa, I've got a question for you. I really think you're outlining a really interesting theoretical framework for your method, and I also enjoyed hearing about how you are combining the fine-tuning method with the close reading method of your training background. The question I have is, when you refer to the text, when you talk about what you're doing and what you're reading, where does the text lie anymore once you're not only deforming the language model with the fine-tuning, you're drawing it from a particular curated data set. I'm just wondering where the text is and what it is and what epistemological weight it has.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure that I have an answer for that. And I think that when you're working with digital forms, it's the work or the object is always elsewhere. It's not, it's very hard to kind of pin it down, I guess. But I can sort of hear an echo. Is my audio okay? Okay. All right. Yeah, so the way, like I said in my response to Pamela, I had mentioned that I was doing a kind of reading, a paranoid reading of the definitions of the terms, which is from the data that I'm feeding into the model. So that paranoid reading, looking for the way that, sex, gender, sexuality are being defined, and the ways that they kind of reify assumptions, right? Social assumptions about those categories. That would not be how I would read the output of whatever the model produces. But yeah, so there is a transformation of the object that into a numerical representation. And then the output would be something that I would want to find a different way of reading. Like I said, drawing from folks like Sedgwick, drawing from folks in queer and trans studies, in that sense. But yes, the project is still, even though I've spent about a year now on it, most of that has been figuring out how to get the data and create the data set. Honestly, that takes so much time. And I've only done it with the federal legislation, so the Congress and the Senate. I have not started to work with the state bills, though I have that data. I haven't started to use that to train. But yeah, so it's still in progress, and I'm still figuring out. But that's a really good point about thinking about like where the text is located, what form it takes, because it definitely does it bears on how we read it. So thank you.
And I can't really see the room.
Hello? Hey, can you all hear me?
Thanks.
Okay. First, I just want to acknowledge the phenomenal presentations from both the speakers. Really insightful stuff. Kind of building on the previous point, and I want to make an observation that it feels very much, Filipa, that you're approaching this in a kind of like play manner, like fine tuning a model and seeing what you get out of it. This thought, it occurs to me to something to offer to that conversation of like, where does the text lie? It feels akin to like choose your own adventure books, where there is a space of potential stories that exists, and your trace through it is like one record of the experience. So in interactive narrative research, the text is really the space of potential. And you get glimpses as to what the contours of that potential are as you engage with the LLM or in the case of games, it's with the interactive narrative. I bring this up because I'm wondering what the end goal of playing with the LLM is. It seemed at some point in your presentation that you were like dissatisfied with what was being output. Maybe it's verbosity, or it seems like you were looking for something or wanting to play with it in a specific way, and it still isn't where you want it to be. And maybe I misinterpreted that intent, but I just wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. Thank you for that wonderful question. I think actually my answer here relates to the other project that was discussed today, and thinking about how we can draw from knowledge that we already have, domain specific or expertise knowledge that we bring into our work with technology, and thinking about along the lines of like design justice, right? So the frustration or the dissatisfaction that you sensed is because in the results so far that I have with my project is because I'm teaching myself machine learning, which is a very large, kind of ambitious, goal. And so I'm learning how to train a model. I'm still in that process. So I feel like it could be better. Like I could do a better job at that. So that's probably where the frustration you're sensing comes from. Though I think you have a really good point that like my whole approach is very much, and it's very much grounded in play and experimentation. In my last job that I just had, until actually June of this year, I was working in a library and as a digital scholarship specialist, and mostly what I did in that job was teach total beginners how to use Python and how to program with Python and use Python for scholarship, for kind of humanistic scholarship. So there's everything that I do, I kind of try to approach from like someone can get up and running with this, and kind of like a sort of not minimal computing, because that is a separate thing, but kind of like up and running, like introductory. And I also think just in the sense of democratizing these tools, I think that's really important, but also from the point of ethics, and specifically with the environmental impact and exploitative impact that these tools have. Large language models are I'm sure you all are aware, they're really destructive to the environment. They're exploiting low-wage workers from the global south. A lot of the data set creation relies on low-wage work from the global south, of the filtering out kind of the harmful materials from these data sets. So they're highly exploitative. They take up a lot of resources. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to work with smaller models and create custom data sets. Obviously, my work is built on kind of these exploitative practices, but I'm trying to create methods that aren't necessarily like bigger is better. I'm not using like ChatGPT or these really large language models. I'm using really, really small models. Things that like someone could get running on most like consumer laptops. And as the technology progresses, like I think this will be more and more feasible. Industry is always going towards bigger and better, but there is also a really strong push for like open source, smaller models in machine learning. So I think that stuff will also be easier as time goes on. But yeah, the focus on play and experimentation is part of a move about democratizing the way that we work with these tools. And also it's very overwhelming for beginners to kind of get started with them. I think the smaller that you make it, the more hands-on that you make it makes it better. Thank you. And I wanted to say also that this relates to what the other presenter was saying about drawing from kind of localized knowledges. And there's already work being done in communities and at the local level that that we can bring into and should be used as we think about the way that we're using this technology in other areas like mental health, for example. Thank you.
So I originally had a question for both panelists, but I think I'm, with Filipa's permission or apologies to her, I'll make hers more of a comment or advice that you can throw away or not, and then ask my question of John. So the advice that you can throw away or not, I love what you're doing. I think it's very sophisticated. I think it's very smart. But I think part of what you're struggling with isn't that just that you're teaching yourself machine learning, but that I think you've already plumbed its secret, which is that it is statistical modeling of languages, and it normalizes and approximates. So although the goal of using smaller models to be environmentally responsible and to also make things more accessible is totally laudable. You know, at some level, you're also thinking about these tools in a more Abiba Berhani-like way, in being critical of them and wondering, you know, what the limitations are or what the specific affordances are of using them for a project like this one, where you're ultimately contending with the mobilization of language in social actors to position certain people as non-normative in a way that is quite repressive for them and does violence to them. So I think there's a real tension there, and I wonder if you might want to simply disentangle certain parts of the wider project. The use of machine learning, a small machine learning model, to show that there is a kind of paranoia effect in the statistical, I call it bell curve thinking. I mean, basically, LLMs are bell curve thinking writ large, always going for the most probable thing, always reducing differences to the edge case or the margin, which through successive models of models, you ultimately lose. You quote unquote forget to cite one good paper on that topic, what those edges are. So perhaps disentangle that from what could be just a more close reading textual analysis of, instead of a data set for training, simply an archive of these legal texts that you can look at through other non-LLM based tools, such as even things like topic modeling, or for that matter, read them. You know, I mean, somebody is presumably reading these things in toto, and probably, given that you're ultimately a literary critic, that could and should include you, to see, you know, that like, in a sense, it would be like a sort of comparative normativization studies, you know, bringing together thoughts about how language models normalize language through their obsession with the most probable, the most plausible, and how that's a type of paranoia that maps onto what's being done to trans people. And then perhaps in some third part, you then bring in your reparative reading. So take that or leave that. I'm sorry that I now should be asking John a question, which in his case, I mean, again, I love the project, and I love that in the comments, John spoke about wanting to expand the ecosystem, and I'm thinking back to Sasha Constanza Chalk and how she ultimately, you know, advised us to be thinking about political economy. You so passionately and so powerfully give us the sense of how chatbots, either purposely designed or just irresponsibly used for mental health cannot even begin to contend with structural racism, lived mental illness, much less, treat it. I mean, it's so inappropriate. And I just wonder, I kept expecting you to bring up Joseph Weizenbaum and the original Eliza chatbot, simply to make the point, perhaps even a footnote, that it is so irresponsible to be using chatbots in this way. And I will point, I feel I can do this even though my name is on it too, because it's more Matthew's work, that in the technical paper about generative AI, Matthew points out, with a little help from co-authors, that the history of NLP was initially and for quite a long time to avoid chat, based on the experience that Weizenbaum had with the ELIZA program, which of course was a mock Rogerian psychotherapist, and he could see the danger there, and he spent the rest of his career warning people not to do this, which people in NLP took seriously for a very, very long time. Now suddenly all of that social context has been forgotten, and chat is the flavor of the moment. Everybody should be gaslighting everybody by turning everything into a bot encounter. So I'm very impressed by the paper and wonder if you have thoughts on that history.
Lauren, for those comments. I'll definitely have a look at that literature. And yes, sorry, I haven't really included it yet in that, and then I will try to incorporate it in future work. So I think what's really interesting to what you said is that, when there are warnings of not to use particular technologies in irresponsible ways, and of course there has been advocacy, but I think this perhaps is where science communication and public engagement really comes in, because, even if people have done these very extensive examinations as to the dangers of chatbots, if people are not aware of it, and then, whether regardless or not, sometimes people are lonely. They want to have a chat, be it in an actual chatbot or conversational agent. I talk to Siri and I say thank you to Siri. So in ways that, and sometimes you're just bored. But, nothing's really preventing people from actually using these, especially if they become readily available, and if there's really a push now to use Copilot, etc. And so, to what extent as well it would be, integrated into Alexa and Amazon. And so I feel like, of course, we could all warn about the dangers of and the responsible uses of these, but in the ecological model, or when they're out there and have been deployed in the wild, to what really nothing prevents people from using them for whatever questions they could come into their minds. And so I think that really poses a significant challenge as to what extent chatbots could put stop gaps to what, and to what extent should it connect when the particular questions or when particular conversations are led in particular directions. What sort of stop gaps are placed? Would a chatbot turn down? Would it block a particular user from experiencing it? And when we think about the range in which these modalities are deployed, if it's used online, then you just use a proxy server, or if it's shut down, so people can just use a VPN or use a different browser to reset the chatbot. If it's Alexa or Siri, to what extent would it be shut down, especially if it's the business of Alexa to be able to talk? Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you. Like, this has been amazing. The word phenomenal covers it. I've learned so much. So I was struggling with when you were talking about Filipa, when you were talking about the machine learning and in relation to the language, and then I was struggling to see the how it translates into some sort of work that is identifiable in amongst the general public, because it then felt that the work is predicated on the fact that anti-trans sentiments are semantic in orientation or syntactic in orientation. But then the more you went and the more I began to reckon with your work, it all made sense. And then thankfully to the algorithm and all, there's this news about transgender Nikki someone who wants something, and then it's on NBC News. I saw it on Instagram, and it's like, oh, transgender Nikki, I don't know this surname, won this da 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 da, and then the comment section was like, no, she's not. She's biologically female, but da da da, and the general public were using these terms in ways that show that they had a deeper understanding of who this person was, as opposed to what media outlets were projecting on people. Then it started making me think about the difference between the legislative and the psychosocial space that we operate in, and how even transphobia itself is not exactly the same as anti-tangible transness or anti-material transness, whereby you find that there's a general sentiment of transphobia, but in the legislative space, it is the materiality or tangibility of that transness that is attacked. And that made me think that, are you possibly looking into that difference in the way that one would think that, oh, what is generally going on in the legislative space is pretty much just an attack on transness in itself, thus making such concepts as paranoia reading or shame very applicable. But then if you think of it in the other way, as anti-material, anti-tangible transness, as the idea of transness in sports, in political spaces, in spaces that create some sense of hypervisibility, then the concept with which you read that sort of anti-transness becomes somewhat different. So I wonder if that's something that you can, it's not necessarily a question you have to answer now, but I think it's something to really think on. Yeah, that's for Filipa. And for John, I'm just thinking of better help. It's making the rounds, I think, in the US, for instance, whereby you connect to this online, you connect online to a therapist, and then it's supposed to actually increase the chance of anonymity as opposed to lessen the chance of anonymity, whereby you just connect and you can change your therapist. It's all of this very customized way of doing therapy. Is that something that you, and BetterHelp is just one of many examples, like, is that something that you think falls into this category of an insensitive way of just practicing psychological help and care? And I was thinking on the basis of therapy itself as capitalistic in that way, almost as if everything that you were saying promotes that idea that the racial or the racial dynamics involved in therapy is not necessarily looked at, because even by way of its operation, by way of its formation, therapy seems to promote a certain idea of talking to a stranger, as opposed to cultural, other cultural categories whereby you actually interact with people around you and find help, psychological help in communities. Is that also something worth considering in line with what your arguments are? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. And sorry, can you remind me your name? I didn't catch it. Oh, okay. Probably don't
My
have
name
the
is
mic
Fumi.
anymore. Fumi, thank you so
Yes.
much, Fumi. So that's an excellent question. I think relates to Kath's question earlier, which is about the state of the text as it goes through different kind of forms. And so delineating between the kinds of between transphobia, anti-transness, and anti-material transness, which I actually haven't heard that phrase, but I really like it, is something that I had not considered. But I will now, certainly. And it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And I also I've seen moments where like you're describing, where some news outlet, some institution, organization will release something, and then the comment section will show like a different level of understanding, right? A different register of thinking about of the issue of transness. So thank you so much for your comment. Or for your question, I
Hello?
should say.
Yeah, thanks as well for those wonderful comments. And I think it's interesting because I think in that case it's used as triage. And I think, different people have different needs. And so to some extent, it could potentially be useful because it could, help locate people in your area, or someone with, some people prefer counselors with similar life experiences or similar identities, whereas others potentially prefer someone with something different. But I think the only danger with that is that, to what extent are these people registered, or to what extent are the processes actually vetted upon, so that, you're actually referred to someone who does not just want to pretend to make money, but someone who's, really registered. And I think it really is, the capitalization of mental health, the same as we see with mental health apps, where a smiling mind will make you smile. Or like, the psychedelic resurgence, where traditional methods of psychedelic use, for instance, by communities are now becoming transformed into, a 20-hour session that needs two psychologists, and that would probably cost $200 an hour. And so, this tension between ensuring democratization and, equal access to mental health could somehow, be in tension with these catalytic demands. And I guess it really depends to what extent AI could help democratize mental health access through different applications, but also to what extent it could be commercialized, in which, some conversational agents could be tailored and sold as something that, would provide you way better advice than ChatGPT. So I think it's a very interesting angle to examine. Yeah.
Hello, Filipa. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm kind of, interested the way you talked about the epistemology of closet, and you kind of think about very two distinct theoretical position, which is coming from the queer studies and the trans studies. One is talking about the marching ante, the other one is talking about the refusal. So I'm kind of curious to know how these two different theoretical positions help us to read the transphobia in AI generated text. So I'm kind of curious to know. And for John, I'm just kind of, I think it is important to remind that like mental health is not a universal thing. Like even if you pay $200 for an hour, it is very hard to find a person, especially when a new migrants move to a new country. It's because mental health and counseling is a very geographical thing. So going to a completely distinct psychological counselor will not necessarily help. I think that's one of the reasons that gap is kind of this chatbot or the AI, commercial AI is kind of, exploiting. So I want some reflection on both the points. Thank you.
John, do you want to go first, since I've been going first the whole time? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I think, yes, as someone who's been, have been international students many times, I think that really, having access to mental health is really a one big issue, but also having culturally, I wouldn't use the word competent, but culturally humble counselors who could give advice. But I think it's like, it's like when these chatbots just use, basically Western-centric models, and it's not really filling any gaps because, well, I mean, I'm not a computer scientist, but, I would assume that, a lot of the advice it would give would still be normalized to the majority of the population, or to the general advice that is, that it gives to someone who is the typical body or the typical text, or where majority of the text is coming from. So maybe it really is not filling a gap in that sense. What probably it is filling is, I guess, having access to someone to temporarily interact with, if that's what's even called, because you're having distress, you probably don't have yet many friends, and then that could feel like that. But I think it also boils down to the end of the day to what structural things universities actually implement to promote the mental health of students. We could not like give every international student a welcome pack with a chatbot access. I don't imagine a world like that. What probably is more important is cultural humility for staff, but also activities that encourage international students to socialize and to perhaps even connect to local communities that are concordant with their home cultures. And I think that has a more profound impact, not wait for the point of mental distress to provide these interventions, but put them at the very start so that we promote mental well-being, but also we provide connection to culture and community.
So thank you for the question. It is that question about different kinds of reading is really, like I'd mentioned already, it's really the a central intervention I'm trying to make with this work. Coming from literature, English literature, that was my training. I'm always thinking about the different ways that people read. And I'm really also thinking about, with my interest in, programming, how you can kind of widen the applicability or people's desire to even kind of grapple with technology and learn technological concepts. So thinking about different ways of reading is really important to this project. And in queer studies, there have been really good conversations. It's particularly with Eve Sedgwick's work. She's been very explicit throughout her career. And she is one of the, just to kind of contextualize, she's one of the kind of early figures like Judith Butler that kind of shaped the field of queer studies. And she moves from a very what she describes as paranoid reading practice, where you're reading text to see kind of what it contains, what it represses. She takes this from, she's a very Foucauldian way of reading, kind of see what's hidden in the text, bring it to the surface. And she does this really well and wonderfully in Epistemology of the Closet. And then later on in her career, she kind of reorients her position around reading towards this more reparative style. And she's actually responding to, in that particular article, she's kind of responding to the AIDS crisis, to what was going on in the 90s, which influenced a lot of, the development of queer studies. But she's responding to this moment where, thinking about the AIDS crisis in the US, there was this idea that the government, didn't care about homosexual people and didn't therefore divert, resources to helping with AIDS research or with the issue. And so thinking about exposing that, thinking about what if we reveal that the government, that there's some kind of conspiracy against homosexual people or something in the US, what would that actually do? What kind of work would that do? And then realizing that it wouldn't really convince people who were maybe homophobic or, who didn't already kind of have those values or have those beliefs. It wouldn't convince them of anything. It wouldn't move them. It wouldn't change minds. So that she's thinking through different ways of reading, kind of with that in mind. And that's what I'm also thinking about now at this moment, at the anti-trans sentiment across the United States, which is really, really polarizing and kind of really rampant, particularly now, like in the past few years, and it's only going to get worse, I think. And even with the White House starting to release things a few days ago, releasing statements that seem to kind of go against previous positions on the role of medical transition, for example. But yeah, I hope that helps to answer your question about reading practices and kind of contextualize it. And I want to thank all of you for all your questions. They've been really great. And feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk more about the project or your own work.
Since we are now a little over time, I want to thank Filipa and John again for their wonderful talks, and I want to thank all of you for coming. We didn't have any questions in the chat, but we had a lively discussion from the floor. And I'm sure you will be continuing that as you go to lunch, those of you who are here, and I will be able to see you from my room. And Filipa, thank you for coming here, for being here remotely, and hopefully the conversation can continue.